Hello there, my most excellent friends. My name is Rachel, GNS, middle. Gilbert and Sullivan is my middle name, and my middle name is my last name. And I am here on behalf of Forbear Theatre to explore the magic of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas by very pedantically ranking every element of them. And today we're going to be looking at the dialogue scenes in Thespis. What is so unusual about this opera is that the music has not survived, apart from with a couple of songs. The version of the dialogue that has survived is known to have quite a lot of mistakes in it, is known to maybe just be a draft. There have been several goes at reconstructing it, and in terms of reconstructions, this is the one I'm looking at by Tony Baker and Tim Henty. And I think this is a really great version and I love this. But I will also be just looking at the original script and seeing where things are different and talking about some things that may have been removed for this version. I am also wearing, even though you can't see it, I'm wearing a Thespis t-shirt. I didn't really think that you'd only see this part of me when I put the t-shirt on. Maybe I'll wear it like that for the whole video. Or maybe I won't, because that's too silly even for me. One thing I want to make clear is that although people today see Thespis as a failure because it didn't survive, at the time it wasn't that common, I don't think, for pieces like this to really take off and do well anyway. The fact that Gilbert and Sullivan's later work did is strange for the time. So the fact that Thespis didn't really survive shouldn't be taken to mean that it was bad. I think it's fair to say it probably wasn't as strong as their later operas because it was the first time they worked together. But I also think there are things about Thespis that are quite unique in a really good way. And Gilbert especially, we don't know what Sullivan did in Thespis particularly, but what Gilbert did in Thespis, he was using this kind of humour that he doesn't use from The Sorcerer onwards, but then does bring back for Utopia Limited and Grand Duke, this very silly avant-garde, taking jokes a little bit too far to make them joyfully awkward. And I think it's important to point out that some of Gilbert's ideas in this opera may not have been completely successful, but they have a charm that I don't think the others have, and I really want to take this opportunity to give it as much love as we possibly can. This is my first video ranking dialogue scenes, and I will ultimately be ranking every single scene in all of the operas in order. So we'll see how well this one goes. It's possible that for other operas I want to use a different system, but for this one I've used the following parameters. I've given him a mark out of 10 for beauty/poetry. That's where language is used skillfully in a way that is aesthetically pleasing. I've given him a mark out of 10 comedy, because, lest we forget, these are meant to be comic operas. And by comedy, and this is true of songs as well, I don't always mean that it has to be laughing out loud funny, just that it contains wit. It contains cleverness. For you might not go, that's hilarious. You might go, oh. So something can get a high mark for comedy just by being witty, clever. It doesn't have to be laugh out loud. I've also given him a mark out of 10 for narrative importance. How important is this scene to the narrative? Does the narrative progress? Finally, I've given him a mark out of 10 for character progression. So, which characters are introduced? How much do we know about the characters within 5 seconds of them speaking? Do the characters make any decisions in the dialogue? Do they learn anything? How can we see them progress as people? Or are these people simply one-dimensional and are just talking about stuff that doesn't make any sense or is boring? We will see. So each scene will get a mark out of 40. I've just unplugged my cat's water fountain, so there won't be the sound of water running in the video, but am I going to record that introduction again? No. So by my count, there are 10 dialogue scenes in Thespis. There's been a couple of occasions in it where I did take 2 scenes and put them together because it includes the same characters, and there are maybe a couple of tiny little snippets of dialogue that I just ignored entirely because anything tiny isn't worth talking about it unless it's particularly iconic. The only one that I can really think about off the top of my head would be the dialogue that the soprano character in The Mikado has before The Sun Whose Rays. Like, that's pretty iconic, but anything that's really tiny, I'm probably not going to bother to talk about, TBH. So, coming in at number 10, we have the dialogue previously mentioned in my duets video between Sparkeion and Nicemis. As I said in that video, I think that the song would have been better had we at all cared about these characters. This is an example of one that I have actually just ignored the song and put the two bits of dialogue together. Even in the first half of the scene, they're not being terribly pleasant to each other. I'd be very surprised if that joke about the creditors landed. Nicemis is describing this beautiful scenery and says, "Oh, I wonder who lives up here? Perhaps somebody who came up here," and Sparkeion finishes for her, "to avoid his creditors." It's like, For a start, I do not buy that he would just interrupt her and finish off her joke. Like, what was she gonna say? I find that disingenuous and not the way that human speech usually goes, and Gilbert can do better than that, I think, and has done better than that. So from this scene, we learn that Nicemis is materialistic and a little bit shallow. And oh, wow, how daring for a soprano character to be materialistic and shallow. So even if we do learn a little bit about her, what we do learn isn't anything particularly interesting. And then we get this like horrible, horrible line. "What a dear little practical mind it is. What a wife you will make." That clunky exposition. This is just not the way that people talk, but in a way that's not even funny. I'll tell you what line is a little bit better. Mind I say, I think a little bit better. And that is, "We shall be happy as king and queen, though we are only a strolling actor and actress." I do quite like that. I think that is deliberately, we are giving you exposition. And I appreciate that is kind of meta humour, and I think that's quite sweet and funny. So I do like that, but I don't think that the "what a wife he will make" is good. I don't think the fact that Sparkeion's asking Nicemis to kiss him and she's rebuffing him, I don't find that particularly problematic. I don't think there's a genuine threat there, but it's still just a bit cringy when you see humour being derived from non-consensual romantic acts. It certainly doesn't make you care about the characters before what is meant to be a love duet. With these love duets, the ones that did well in my duet list were ones where you really got to know and care about the characters, and when you don't care about them, they just fall completely flat and they're just boring. I think no matter how musically good they were, that was true in every case. Like, Words of Love Too Loudly Spoken is so good musically, but it came very far down the list because you just don't care. And then the dialogue that comes after the song just completely does not match with the energy of the song. I understand that we don't know exactly what Sullivan's music was, but still, come on, listen to this. "Very well, if you won't have anything to say to me, I know who will." It just doesn't vibe with what's happened previously in the song. Also, Sparkeion trying to pit these women against each other, and then we're probably meant to, as an audience, think that Nicemis is this nasty, catty woman, but she is being provoked to say the things that she's saying. And it's just not pleasant to read about all these shallow, materialistic people. I don't really understand what joy there is to be derived from seeing characters like this. And even though she is provoked, I just don't find her insulting Daphne charming. She keeps her eyes open. Yes, one of them. Which one? The one she doesn't wink with? It's just mean. It's weird how Gilbert is trying to get us to be entertained by unlikable characters. And when I say that, I don't mean characters like the alto from The Mikado or Scapio and Fantis, who we love to hate. I mean just characters that are just unpleasant and uncomfortable and actually just a bit awkward to watch. They're shallow, but not in a way like the soprano and tenor in The Mikado are. They are shallow in a way that is just boring. Sorry, Gilbert. I did not enjoy this scene. So for that one, they gave it a 3 for beauty/poetry. I gave it a 3 for comedy. Because it has the one joke about strolling actor and actress, which is just, apart from the unnecessary gendering of the word actor, they are both actors. 5 for narrative importance. You learn a bit about how the marriage ceremony works, and you learn that they're meant to be in love, and you learn about Daphne. So there's a little bit going on there. And I gave it a 5 for character progression because, as I say, you do learn a bit about these characters. Coming in at number 9, we have the dialogue between Mercury and Thespis in Act II. I was very surprised, actually, in reading this scene and examining it closely, how bad it was. Because I have some personal history with this scene. Oh, what is this? Oh, it's not my award for Best Female Performer at the 21st International Gilbert and Sullivan Festival in Harrogate for my portrayal of Mercury in the Savoy Net Performing Group's production of Thespis. Oh wait, it is. So I do have some experience with this scene, and I remembered this as being really funny. I remember this scene as being an absolute hoot, but I think it was because I was solving a Rubik's Cube during it, and maybe that was the joke, because actually when I look at the scene now and look at the lines, they're not actually funny. It's, in a way, it's too conversational, it's too naturalistic, and it's just not terribly well artistically constructed, in my opinion. First of all, though, I do like Thespis getting Sillemon to leave. I think that's very funny. Sillemon, you can retire. Sir, don't pretend you can't when I say you can. I've seen you do it. That is funny. I like that. I'll buy that. I also like how they say the phrase topsy-turvy in this scene. I remember, actually, it being really difficult to learn these lines in a way that it isn't difficult to learn Patience's lines, for example. This one was really hard, and I remember being so nervous I was going to forget these lines because they were so weird and bitty and oddly placed and oddly ordered. I may be blowing my own trumpet here, but I think the only reason that scene was funny was because me and the man playing Thespis were good. I also find it a bit clunky that a year has passed, and it doesn't really seem like that long has passed. And I also find that Mercury's character doesn't seem to be very consistent between scenes. So in a later scene that I'll be talking about, Mercury says, "Oh, whenever I open my mouth, he jumps down my throat." But Mercury seems to be like totally in control of this scene, but in a way that's just a bit irritating, like almost smug. Very simple, isn't it? Ah, I dare say you will do it standing on your head very soon. It's just all hinting at something about to happen, as if this is meant to be arousing tension, but there's just no tension at all. It just seems quite wet to me. So many of these lines start with, well, and I find that a bit amateur-y. Well, but, you know, we know as much as anybody knows, you know. And, well, then, give the father of the gods his due. Well, but you see, you leave too much to accident. Well, Mercury, if I do. Well, you see, you don't understand how these things work. Why does every line start with well? I just don't think these lines are well written. Oh my God, the cat fountain is on again. The cat fountain is now off. I just don't think these lines are very well written, personally. I do a lot of writing myself, and I don't think these lines are terribly well written. I don't think Gilbert was really intending them to be quite well written. This is a very specific style of theatre, and it just doesn't really stand up to scrutiny today, I don't think. I am an easy man, and I like to make things as pleasant as possible. What did I do the day we took office? Why, I called the company together and I said to them, here we are, you know, gods and goddesses. Like, I don't know if this is funny or terrible. Like, it's quite funny that he has this huge monologue, but he's not saying anything. Don't let us be hampered by routine and red tape. Let's set the original gods an example and put a liberal interpretation on our duties. If it occurs to anyone to try an experiment in his own department, let him try it. If he fails, there's no harm done. If he succeeds, it is a distinct gain to society. Take it easy, I said, and at the same time, oh my God, make experiments. Don't hurry your work, do it slowly and do it well. And here we are, after a 12-month, and not a single complaint or single petition has reached me. It's a really long speech for not very much having been said. It seems like there's meant to be tension, but you just don't feel it. and it just seems quite smug on Mercury's behalf. And there's no line that I think is that funny. I guess I suppose there are some complaints. Yes, there are some. Oh, perhaps there are a good many. There are a good many. Oh, perhaps there are a thundering lot. There are a thundering lot. That's kind of funny. I guess it depends on the delivery. Again, I think our delivery was compromised by the fact that I was solving a Rubik Cube in it, which I thought that was very funny. But maybe we were just trying to distract from how bad this scene is. There's not, considering this is meant to be a comic opera, I don't think this is a funny scene. So I gave this scene a 4 out of 10 for beauty/poetry. I don't think the lines are very well written. I also gave it a 4 out of 10 for comedy. Yeah, that thundering lot is quite funny, I suppose. If Mercury is meant to be this mischievous scamp, I guess there's a little bit of comic mileage there, but it just needs the actor to do the work, and that's where I think it isn't so good. I gave it a 6 for narrative importance because we do learn that a year has passed. We do learn the process by which these complaints are gathered and the fact that they only get announced once a year. So we learn some stuff. I gave it a 5 for character progression. We do seem to learn that Mercury's a little bit mischievous, but then that character is not really backed up by what he says about Thespis later, unless he's lying, but it's just not clear, really. So it gets a 19 out of 40. Not horrendous, but not quite half marks. So I think we can do a little bit better than that. Number 8 goes to the scene between Jupiter, Diana and Apollo in Act I. So I do think that there is some promise to this scene. I do think the characters are quite funny. I love the fact that Jupiter has appeared and he's this old man, this very tired, exhausted old god. I mean, it is called God's Grown Old. So yeah, that is kind of the story. I love the joke about the human sacrifices. I know the guy that did it when we did it really made it like quite creepy. Human sacrifices. There are worse things than oxen, pigs and sheep, and that gives the director a chance to put in something funny into that line. I don't know why it says preserved Australian beef. Perhaps that was some topical thing at the time, but it's funny because it's just a very oddly specific thing. So I think even if you don't change that and you don't update that, I still like that joke. I think it's really silly and funny. But then Gilbert has this tendency to over-labour jokes sometimes, and as I said in the previous video, sometimes he does it so much that it becomes funny again. But then there's a couple of examples in Thespis where it just falls flat, like after the preserved Australian beef joke. I don't like it at all. You won't mention it, it might go further. It couldn't fare worse. You know, you don't need to keep going, just end it at the preserved Australian beef. Like, that is funny. I think that Gilbert hadn't really quite locked into what his style was. And I also appreciate that maybe this wasn't the final script and maybe they did improve these things with the 2 weeks of rehearsals they got. It wasn't even 2 weeks, apparently. According to this, it was just the mornings of 2 weeks because nobody was free to rehearse, and that was actually the reason it maybe didn't do as well as it should have done. So who knows what the final actual performed script was. It might have been a bit cleaner than this. But I do think that this scene has promise. We do certainly learn a lot about why the gods are starting to get less relevant. Diana and Apollo don't seem to have realised how bad it's got on Earth, but Jupiter is letting them know. So we do see through Diana and Apollo's eyes that their situation is more drastic than they thought it was. So I appreciate that we are learning information in this scene, and it does have a little bit of comedy in it. I only gave it a 4 for beauty/poetry. As I say, I just think that we don't see the magic of Gilbert's beautiful aesthetic language in this scene. I also gave it a 4 for comedy, a little bit better than the previous scene comedy-wise, but it's only really got that one human sacrifices joke in it. I did give it a 7 for narrative importance. I do think it's quite clean. We learn a lot of stuff in this scene and we learn a bit about the characters as well. Jupiter, it's immediately obvious who he is, and I think he's quite a clear character, so I appreciate that. But I don't think you learn too much more about Diana and Apollo. I do think these two characters are a little bit underdeveloped. I've given it a 5 for character progression. Not terrible, but not amazing. Number 7 is a scene between Jupiter, Mercury, and Thespis. This is the one that occurs after the re-entrance of the 3 gods in the second act. This is the first scene we've talked about where we really do see some emotional stakes, so for that I appreciate it. I think there is some comedy in this scene when Mercury says, "Please sir, that's what I asked you when you went away." As Mercury, I did appreciate getting that line to say, but then as I alluded to, the stuff that Mercury says here that doesn't really add up with the previous scene, whenever I open my mouth he jumps down my throat. Is that really true? It doesn't seem to be true, because it seems like Mercury is the one totally in control of that previous scene. It isn't pleasant to have a fellow constantly jumping down your throat. It's the sort of thing I cannot digest. It's quite funny. I do like it when Thespis comes in and says, "There's going to be a row," because the stakes here are extremely high, and he's trivialising them and also kind of inviting the audience in, which I think is really charming and sweet. I don't get why Thespis is trying to say there are no complaints when Mercury in the previous scene has told him there are loads of complaints. I don't get if he's trying to lie, but then if he was trying to lie, I think that would have been a bit more obvious. All in all, I find this scene, even if it is maybe funnier and some of the language is a bit more appropriate, I just find it's a bit messy and confusing and doesn't really fit with some of the stuff we already know about these characters. I find that Gilbert, when he was writing, maybe wasn't terribly careful with making his characters consistent between scenes and maybe rushed it slightly. I hope this wasn't the final version of this script. They got 5 for beauty/poetry. I think it's better than a Jupiter, Diana, Apollo scene, and certainly better than the Thespis Mercury scene. I have given it a 6 out of 10 for comedy, mostly for Thespis saying there's going to be a row and Mercury saying, "Well, that's what I said when you went away." So there are some funny moments there which I think the audience would laugh at. I also gave it a 6 for narrative importance. We do learn here that there are stakes and that there is a bit of a threat here. What kind of threat we're not sure about yet, but Mercury does seem nervous by these proceedings. And I gave it a 6 out of 10 for character progression. Even if it's a bit messy and confusing, I do think there are moments where the previous characterization of these people does shine through, like there's going to be a row. I think that is exactly the kind of thing Thespis would say, like inviting in the audience and trivialising what these old gods are doing. So I like that, and I do think that it is somewhat faithful to the characters. I just think Gilbert could have done a little bit better. Number 6, I have given to the first scene of Act 2, the scene that's between Sillemon, Nicemis, Prettia, and Sparkeion. There's a lot of stuff going on in this scene, quite a few little bits and pieces are happening, but Sillemon is the person there who holds it all together. I think it's quite important when casting Sillemon that it's not somebody who could come across as being predatory. These lines read in a certain way could be a little bit uncomfortable. So when we did it, it was William Remmers playing this part and he was very funny. I think he also won an award. He was able to do it in a way that gave him less status, so made it very unthreatening, so gave the characters around him the power, which I think was a very good decision. I don't think it's as funny as it could have been. It's a little bit laboured, that whole exchange about him being a dear old thing and him telling the audience, "Oh, she said I'm a dear old thing. Did you hear that? Deputy Venus said I'm a dear old thing." I think it goes on a little bit long and I lose the thread of where the joke is. Sometimes though, I do find it really funny when Gilbert has these extraneous lines. Like the line I find the funniest in the scene is, "Do you know, I am going to ask you a favour." Why say that? I like how manipulative they're all being. Nicemis isn't quite as unlikable, I think, as she was in the previous scene, even though she does say a couple of mean things. She's mean to Prettia, as I was saying in the Soprano videos. "No one who saw your face would doubt it. No one who knew her character would." Like, what does that even mean? What are you talking about? Prettia's exchange about having to make love to her father. I don't think when Gilbert used the phrase making love, he actually means sex, which makes it less gross, but it's still a bit weird and uncomfortable to listen to. I get the joke, but the joke is just a little bit too gross, I think, to be funny. I do love, though, how they're talking about this really gross thing in a very matter-of-fact way. It interferes with my conception of the character. It spoils the part. But still, the sun at night, I don't like the idea. This is the way that actors talk. We have these conversations about very grandiose topics, but talk about them in this very matter-of-fact way. When I was doing Othello in the summer, we'd arrive at a different space every day, and often we couldn't put the stage up and we just had to make do with the space we had. And there'd be so many conversations like, ooh, where should I kill you today? Shall I kill you over by the door? Or how am I going to strangle you? Shall I strangle you here? Or how am I going to slap you? Shall we stand here while I slap you? It is kind of absurd, the conversations that actors have, like sentences that you'd never hear spoken anywhere else. And I do like, and I believe this is one of the first instances, there are a couple of them in Thespis actually, but it's the first one I'm going to talk about in the dialogue scenes, where a character will explicitly say, oh, you don't know this song? Well, then I will sing it to you. And I like that. I think it is purposefully a bit silly. And I think that in this sense, it does actually work really well. Did you never hear of the young lady who was engaged to Cousin Robin? Never. Then I'll sing it to you. I gave it a 5 for beauty and poetry. There's some nice moments, but it's not as sophisticated as his later stuff. I did give it a 6 for comedy. I think we are starting to get a little bit of a handle on what's funny. I gave this scene a 6 out of 10 for narrative importance. Even though the plot isn't really progressing, we do get to learn a bit more about these characters' priorities and the way that, as a whole, these mortals are dealing with their new situation. I also gave it a 7 out of 10 for character progression because I do think that you get to learn a bit about the characters in this scene. Nicemis gets a little bit more fleshed out. Sparkeion and Prettia you haven't even seen yet. And you get to learn a bit more about Sillemon as well, and the fact that he is really enjoying being in this position of power and loves getting all this praise. I do like this scene. I think we start to see the Gilbert that we know shine through a little bit. Number 5 is the scene between Diana, Apollo and Mercury. This is actually the first scene in the opera. And it starts off pretty well. I do like to see Apollo and Diana introduced, the way that they're failing to be as inspirational and as heroic as maybe the audience would have considered the Greek gods to be. So that's a fun subversion of expectation. I do think that Apollo's initial speech is a little bit long. I don't think it's quite as egregious as Thespis's big speech to Mercury in that second act scene, but it's a little bit laboured. I just don't think Gilbert still quite clicked into what exactly was funny and what wasn't yet. But I love the introduction of Mercury. It's fun that he gets some music to come on to. And you immediately understand that this is an overworked character, which is absurd because he is also a god. It's just very charming, and it's lovely to see a character that is mistreated but isn't being downtrodden about it. He's still obviously got lots of energy. This was played by Nellie Farron, I think, who is this very famous kind of acrobatic burlesque performer. And it is just a hoot to play this scene. It's really fun, and it really well precedes Mercury's song. There are some moments of laziness here. Gilbert writes for both Diana and Apollo the line, I don't know how it is, like in very quick succession. So it's just an example of Gilbert maybe just not being very careful when he was writing. But there's something also quite inspiring about it. It does remind me that Gilbert wasn't always this very perfect writer, that his early work is definitely weaker than his later work, and it's inspiring to see that he was able to become this very accomplished playwright, even if this wasn't terribly good. Some of Mercury's poetry is beautiful. I've made thunder for Jupiter, odes for Apollo, battles for Mars and love for Venus. It's quite rude. Also, Mercury talks about, and I can't help being down all night. And is that rude? Or am I just reading too much into it? I don't know. But Gilbert isn't rude in his other pieces, so it's quite fun seeing him be a little bit rude in this scene. The characters aren't terribly real or down to earth. I mean, they are gods, but they are funny and silly and vibrant, and I do appreciate that. They're certainly better characters than Nicemis and Sparkeion, in my opinion. There are also characters that the audience already know about, so as I say, it's that fun subversion of expectation. I gave this scene a 5 out of 10 for beauty and poetry. That line at Mercury had brought it up to a 5. I also gave it a 6 for comedy as well, for similar reasons. I do think there are a few funny lines and Mercury is a funny character, but still there are some jokes I feel are a bit laboured as well. I gave it a 7 for narrative importance. I think you learn quite a bit about the way things are right off the bat. And it does paint quite a vivid picture. And the audience, I think, understand this is what the story is going to be about. And I also gave it a 7 out of 10 for character progression. You learn a lot about Apollo and Diana. I don't think you learn too much more about them after this scene, to be honest. But this scene paints enough of a picture that's something to go on for the rest of the show. And you certainly learn a bit about Mercury, and you continue to learn a bit more in the song. Number 4 is the scene between Jupiter and Thespis. There are actually quite a lot of other people on stage when this scene begins, but I believe all the actual speaking is just occurring between those two characters. I'm really starting to enjoy these scenes now. This is probably the first scene that I think, yeah, that is a good scene. Maybe a few little bits that fall flat, but generally good going. I think that line, "Don't know ya, is so funny. I love how he introduces that line and then immediately just says it to Jupiter, the literal king of the gods, without really understanding who it is. But then when Jupiter does reveal himself as king of the gods, Thespis is still treating him really frivolously. And that's what I think is so unique to Gilbert and Sullivan operas, this artificial lowering of the stakes in a way that is really funny. A good deal of this sort of thing, which is like in Gondoliers. I like how Gilbert brings back his favourite lines. I don't think that's lazy at all. I love it. I love the fact that he says, "That is the idea I intended to convey," in 3 separate operas. This is great. Thespis just has this really overinflated ego where he seems to think that he is more important than Jupiter, even after Jupiter has revealed he is a god. But when we actually see Thespis performing, there's not really too much of that, but when we see him in acting mode, his acting is very one note. It's all just very over the top and very camp, and maybe that's not explicit in the text, but that's just the way I would see somebody playing it, just based on what the text is. I've seen quite a lot of people on Facebook, and you know what? I would actually put myself in this group, so I'm not poo-pooing people like this at all, but you'll be in a GNS discussion group and someone will say, "Well, when I directed the piece, I did this," or "when I did..." And there are a lot of egos in the GNS community, bless us. I am one of them. It's inspired me maybe to write a Gilbert and Sullivan style piece where Gilbert comes back from the dead and he's got all these GNS super fans just completely putting him down. It's like, "Oh, no, but I know what Gilbert would have wanted." And he's like, "Oh, I am Gilbert, I'm right here." It kind of gives me that kind of vibe. Like how it's always so funny when the characters in a scene are totally at odds status-wise. Like they both believe that they should be the higher status person in this scenario, and how the lead actor of this little known company is somehow more high status than this god. Is just silly. It's topsy-turvy. Thespis has a real opportunity here to actually talk to Jupiter and learn about what kind of person he is, and to use that as inspiration for his acting. But does he do that? No. He's admitted that he's played Jupiter a lot. And he seems to think that his interpretation of Jupiter is more valid than the actual Jupiter. And that's what I find so hilarious, this total self-obsession. And the fact that I know a lot of people who are actually like that, who think that their opinion about how a certain character should be played is the only valid opinion. I think I do suffer from that a little bit, maybe when it comes to certain parts, but I'd like to think on the whole I am more open-minded than a lot of people. After the initial introduction, it's a serviceable scene. Some story is exchanged, they decide what's going to be done. It's not terribly funny after that initial meeting, but I do think that initial meeting did bring the score quite high. I gave it a 6 for beauty/poetry. Again, we're not extremely aesthetically pleasing, but this scene I do think is quite clever. I gave it a 7 for comedy, for all the reasons I've said. I also gave it a 7 for narrative importance, because we learn about what's going to happen next and we see how these two characters are sorting out their problems and their differences. How Thespis is going to help Jupiter solve this issue that he's been having. I gave it a 6 for character progression. I think the characters are well represented in the text, but I don't know if you really learn too much more about them other than Thespis's ego. You don't learn too much more about Jupiter. Jupiter isn't terribly well fleshed out, I don't think, compared to Thespis. And there was an opportunity to do it here, which maybe wasn't quite taken, but I do think this is a good scene. I gave it 26 out of 40, which I think is a perfectly serviceable mark. Number 3, I have given to the scene that precedes the quartet between Thespis, Daphne, Nicemis and Sparkeion. There are lots of great things about this scene. There are some things I would change, so right off the bat, I don't think it's very clean that Daphne comes in crying with the book and then Thespis alerts her to the fact that she's Calliope and she goes, wait, that's it. It's like, well, didn't you see that in the book? Like, it's a bit weird. You could play it like she actually does come in with the information and she's faking crying, or maybe she's crying because she's tried to tell Sparkeion this and he hasn't listened to her, but it's just not terribly clear story-wise. And for that, I do think that could be a bit cleaner. I love the line, drop your Daphne, assume you're Calliope. I love the way Thespis talks. He's a really funny character. I didn't know he was married to them. Sir, this is the family edition. It's a joke. I do think it's quite funny that there is a book in the library of Olympus about the gods and it's a family edition. Like, why would that be there? I do think that is quite silly, and it's deliberately silly. And I always appreciate deliberate silliness. I feel like only Gilbert would have thought of that line. You don't really see that elsewhere. I think that's so uniquely Gilbert. He's my husband. He's your brother. It's delightful. I love the little exchange. He goes out every night with that thing. Perhaps he's trying an experiment. Because I previously alluded to all these experiments. And I love that kind of deadpan, slightly self-deprecating humour. There's a couple of times where it happens in this show and I think it's so funny. And it's something that I think that Gilbert doesn't really bring back until maybe Utopia Limited and the Grand Duke, this very deadpan style. It's quite modern sounding, I think, that style of humour. The question is, who are we all, and what is our relation to each other? I don't think this is Gilbert's best pre-song joke, as in a joke where we openly say we're going to sing a song and then we sing it. It's a nice dramatic end to the scene, and it brings us into the song nicely. I think this is definitely one of the better scenes in the show. I gave it a 5 for beauty and poetry. I think that's fair. I don't think it's maybe quite as advanced poetically as the Jupiter and Thespis scene that we've just been discussing. I also don't think it's quite as funny as it. I only gave it a 6 out of 10 for comedy, but as I say, there are some funny lines in it. I did, however, give it an 8 out of 10 for narrative importance, because we are starting to learn how this system that they've set up is unravelling, and we are getting to learn more about Sparkeion and Nicemis. This story's been put on hold. We got a little snippet of it earlier on in the second act, but it's largely been put on hold since the middle of Act I. And also for that reason, I gave it an 8 out of 10 for character progression. I think we learn a little bit more about Daphne and Nicemis and Sparkeion. Sparkeion doesn't really seem to care that much what happens, and Nicemis doesn't seem too offended by this. It is funny how these characters talk about marriage in these very transactional, quite unromantic terms. It does mean that maybe we don't care emotionally for the characters that much, but it is very funny. And it is quite topsy-turvy and not very real, but in a way that is quite charming. Overall, this scene gets a 27 out of 40, so just a little bit better than the one before it. Number 2, I have given to the court scene. So that's Thespis, Mercury, and ensemble. It involves Father Time and Tipsian and lots of these characters. I really like this scene. I had a very good time when I was Mercury when we did this. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that it is usual for the gods to assemble once a year to listen to mortal petitions. Doesn't seem to me to be a good plan. Alright, I love that subversion of expectation there. I love that change of energy in the middle of lines. This craving for perpetual change is the curse of the country. It's totally reasonable that people wouldn't want it to be constantly raining, and yet they're complaining about how unreasonable people are being. Oh, hello, Dora. You won't often see Dora because she's quite shy, but you get to look at her butt now. I absolutely love the Simon / Father Time section. When we did that bit, it was one of the few times in my acting career where I have really struggled to keep a straight face on stage. That guy who played that part was an absolute star. He was so funny. He was just absolutely fearless, even though he was really young. But these lines are also just funny as it is. Sunday comes after Saturday. Sunday won't go on duty after Friday. Sunday's principles are very strict. December can't begin until November has finished. November can't finish because I've abolished Saturday. And it makes sense. That's the funny thing about it. The funny thing about Gilbert's humour is that it does make sense, but just in a way that's overly semantic and just not at all reflective of reality. The grapes are only growing ginger beer, and a very good thing too. I love the character of Tipsian. I think it's so funny that... So we've had this person who has previously been an alcoholic. So in other plays at the time, I imagine being drunk was played for laughs. And that would have been quite a common joke to see on the stage, of somebody being very drunk and like swaying and dancing and being loud. Whereas we don't get to see that part of Tipsy. Like, that's in the past. He's reformed now. He's sober. And it's just so funny that we are only starting to see this character when he's become, boring and very straight. But that is exactly why he's funny, because he isn't funny. I have a ton of personal experience with alcohol problems, and I love to joke about it. I think it's enormously cathartic to me to see people joking about this stuff and not having it a topic that's taboo. And having a character who is a reformed alcoholic being around all these ridiculous characters and actually genuinely being really thankful to Thespis for getting him to stop drinking. My preserver, I cannot thank you enough. That is so funny, having this totally straight, sober character in amongst all this chaos, who himself used to be like that, and whose stage time is made up of him thanking Thespis for him no longer being that way. I think that's so funny. Why would you make Tipsy and Bacchus? What a silly thing. Why would you make Simon, the youngest guy, Father Time? It's just all going wrong. It's all absurd. And that's what I love about this scene, how utterly chaotic it is. At least we can improve the ginger beer. Let all the ginger be extracted from it immediately. The grapes will have to be dug out, like potatoes. There's so much stuff going on and there's so much scope for comedy coming from so many different people that I absolutely love this scene. I think this is a really top quality scene, and maybe the beauty of the language isn't quite as apparent as in some of Gilbert's later work, but I do think he's got the beginnings here of this chaotic absurdity that does rear its head in later works. I only gave it a 6 out of 10 for beauty of language. I think once we're actually moving on to Gilbert and Sullivan's better known work, there'll be some 10s that come out there. And then I think we'll really get a better idea about why these ones came so low. I can always amend these marks if I think maybe they're even too high. But it is difficult to gauge where a 10 would be at this stage because I've only got Thespis in front of me. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for comedy. I do think it's funny, but I think a 7 is probably about right. I did give it a 9 for narrative importance. Here is where we see what they've been doing all year, and here is where we see all the mistakes they've been making. I also gave it an 8 for character progression. You get to watch Mercury become a little bit smugger, you get to see Thespis getting a little bit deflated, and you get Timid and highlighted, Simon highlighted, and Tipsy and highlighted again, which is always nice to see chorus principals get their moment. So the final scene we're going to be talking about, and which ranks number 1 in my Thespis scenes video, is the picnic scene. First of all, I got into a huge rabbit hole about the origin of the word picnic, because I saw that picnic is actually hyphenated in the lib, and I realised that it comes from the French pique-nique. People think it might come from the French to, pick at something, and then nique means worthless thing. The idea is that everyone brings something along and then you all share it. I suppose we'd call that a potluck, but I guess a picnic could be that as well. I guess it's just outdoors rather than indoors. I love all the stuff that the people have brought to the picnic. I think that is so funny. A piece of ice for the claret cup. So Sparkeion has had a piece of ice this whole time. That is hilarious. As I've said before in the previous scene, I love how well these characters are defined. I love the character of Tipsy, and I think that is very clever. And even if he's only highlighted in these 2 scenes, he can make such an impact, and I think it's very funny. There's also a joke which he later brings back for the Mikado. Virtue only triumphs at night from 7 till 10. Vice gets the best of it during the other 24 hours. Isn't that interesting that he then makes a song out of that in the Mikado? That's so cool. So you can see that Gilbert is having these ideas which he does then develop in later operas. I love the why did the gods make him a manager? Why did the gods make him a manager? Why did the gods make him a manager? I think that is absurd, but hilarious. It isn't a conundrum, it's a misanthropical question. I love the way these characters speak to each other. It is just so chaotic. I do think this would take a lot of rehearsal to get really clean. If you are going to do all the text as completely the way it's written, it would take a lot of work to get this really snappy and good. But it would be worth putting the work in. Sparkeion is such a bad guy. This is all because Nicemis wouldn't kiss him. Now he's all over Daphne. And I love how Thespis is just quite blasé about it. He doesn't really respond too much to Nicemis's flirting. And I don't think that's out of any kind of respect for Nicemis or Sparkeion. I think he's just like, oh no, like I'm above all you people. But he's also quite charming with them as well. And then there's this absolutely brilliant little exchange. It's one of these totally deadpan moments that I think is brilliant. Ha! Ha! It is well for those who can laugh. What is there for me? There is some claret cup and lobster salad. I think if that line is delivered with just a beat before it and with total deadpan energy, that could be one of the funniest lines in Gilbert and Sullivan. Just this differing energy. Thespis is such a fun character. There are so many highs and lows with him. There's so much scope for comedy. Let us speak for a moment about the characters that are actually cut in this version. Now, On the one hand, I can see why they're cut. These characters are called Stupidas and Preposterous, and I guess they're meant to be the clowns, or one is a villain. I don't really get what Stupidas is. It's not really very well defined. I can see why Baker and Henty cut them. They do seem extraneous, and they might slow down the narrative. It does make just as much sense to give those lines to other people. So they do, there's a lot of funny stuff that they say that those lines can just be given out to others. And you don't really lose, I think, too much from not having a minute. But I do just want to take a moment to talk about them, because I actually happen to think that these characters could have been brilliant had they just been developed a little bit more. The first exchange that Preposterous has with Thespis is not good. Give him a picnic, somebody. Be quiet, Preposterous. Don't interrupt. Ha! Ha! Shut up again, but no matter. What? I don't really get how that works. I think it's meant to be a bit like Lady Jane's crushed again, but it doesn't land in the same way. I think, oh gosh, Dora's got glowing eyes. Hello, Dora. When Lady Jane does it in Patience, it's said in such a way that still keeps the energy of the scene up. I don't like negative energy or like deflated energy in scenes, especially in theatre. I think it's not good to ever drop the energy. If you're going to have moments of silence, they need to be full of tension. Otherwise, I think the audience breathe out and then you have to get them back again, which I think can be hard work. This is what Preposterous says. It is enough that I am downtrodden in my profession. I will not submit to imposition out of it. It is enough that as your heavy villain I get the worst of it every night in a combat of 6. I will not submit to insults in the daytime. I have come out, ha-ha, to enjoy myself. I get the impression that Preposterous usually plays the villain, but in real life just wants to fit in, and he isn't treated very well by Thespis or the other members of the company, apart from Stupidas, who seems weirdly attached to him in a way that Preposterous does not care for. I'm not sure who Preposterous is. Is he unable to drop his villain persona, but then the psychological effect of being a villain has caused him to act in this really bizarre way even when he's not on stage? I'm not really sure what Gilbert is trying to say here, just because his character is so underdeveloped. I don't really quite understand who Stupidas is or what their relationship is. Stupidas seems to be consoling him a lot or going to comfort him and actually stands up for him, I think, at some point. Are they a bit queer-coded? I don't think so. I don't think Gilbert would have thought that, but that's certainly what I thought when I read it. It seems like Stupidas kind of fancies Preposterous, but Preposterous doesn't feel the same way and is a bit oblivious. I get why these characters are cut, but at the same time, there could have been like a really fun little side plot going on here. You don't get to see these characters in the second act, they just vanish, so we don't know what gods they became. Like, it would have been funny if Preposterous had to be somebody really bright and energetic and not downhearted and evil. And then Preposterous has the pre-song joke. And I think this is a really, really good joke. I think it was given to Sillemon when we did it, where Thespis says to the chorus, "Do you know this song?" And they go, yes, we know it. Preposterous says, "I do not know it. It is ever thus, doomed to disappointment from my earliest years." I feel like he should have an aria here about his issues. I want to write a whole new Thespis with Preposterous actually being a big part and having Sparkeion as this minion type character who just hangs around with him and just agrees with him, like, yeah, I agree with you, Preposterous. Yeah. Yes, Daenerys. I also think that Preposterous is a really underdeveloped character, and it's a shame that he didn't play a bigger part or was in any other scene in this opera. I gave this scene a 6 for beauty/poetry. Again, I'm just leaving room for other scenes and other operas to do a lot better. I still don't think this quite matches those. I did give it a 9 for comedy. There are so many laugh out loud moments. It does, I think, depend slightly more on actors really understanding the text and delivering these lines with confidence and conviction, but still there's a lot of scope to be funny, which is the important thing. And it's just so chaotic, a little bit like the courtroom scene. The claret cup stuff is so silly. The idea that they all brought these ingredients, that nobody brought the actual claret or the lobster, is great. I gave it an 8 for narrative importance and an 8 for character progression. I think that both of those things are done well in this scene. We get to learn about them as a theatre company, about how these events usually work. We get to learn about Thespis's relation to all of the people in his company. It's a perfect scene between two really great songs. This section here, from the beginning of Climbing Over Rocky Mountain to the end of the railway song, I think is a really good, fun, strong section. And this is a reason why Thespis is really worth doing, even if we're not entirely certain what the music is. It is definitely worth doing because there are some very strong moments in it, and this scene brings me so much joy. I'm really glad that I was able to be positive about a lot of the dialogue in this opera. I was worried that I was going to find it very lacking compared to the others, but there are some moments of genius, and as I said before, it's lovely to see where Gilbert started off and then how far he came after that. And it is inspiring to see that he had the confidence to do some really quite off-the-wall humour, which might have been a style at the time, but his unique take on humanity is something that you can see in Thespis. It's most definitely recognisable as Gilbert's work. And for that, I'm very glad of its existence. I'm very glad it wasn't completely lost. And it deserves completely to be talked about as one of Gilbert and Sullivan's operas. Thank you very much for watching. I had a really good time making this one. Please remember to hit that like button and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time where we will be talking about the bass characters. See you then!